It all started innocently enough. I was a young professional living alone in a bustling city, enjoying the independence that came with my newfound freedom. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I began to notice something unsettling, a feeling of being watched. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia, attributing the unease to the stresses of city living. But as the sensation persisted, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was lurking in the shadows, just beyond my field of vision. It wasn't until one fateful night that my suspicions were confirmed. I had just returned home from a late-night shift at work, exhaustion weighing heavy on my shoulders. As I trudged up the steps to my apartment, a chill ran down my spine, a feeling of being watched, intensified to the point of suffocation. I glanced over my shoulder, but the dimly lit hallway revealed nothing out of the ordinary. With a shake of my head, I chalked it up to tiredness and pushed open the door to my apartment. But as I stepped inside, a sense of dread washed over me like a wave crashing against the shore. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I surveyed the dimly lit room. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling of being watched lingered like a shadow in the night. With trembling hands, I locked the door behind me and retreated to the safety of my bedroom. As I lay in bed, the darkness seemed to press in around me, suffocating me with its oppressive weight. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains sent my heart racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was lurking just beyond the walls of my apartment. Hours passed in agonizing silence, each minute dragging on like an eternity. Just as I began to drift into an uneasy sleep, a sound shattered the stillness of the night, a soft thud, followed by the unmistakable creak of the floorboards outside my bedroom door. Panic gripped me as I lay frozen in bed, my heart pounding in my chest like a drumbeat. The darkness seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and I knew in that moment that I was not alone in my apartment. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, praying that help would arrive before it was too late. Minutes passed like hours as I waited in terrified silence, each second dragging on like a lifetime. The sound of my own heartbeat echoed in my ears, drowning out all other noise. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the thudding footsteps ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. With bated breath, I listened for any sign of movement, but the apartment remained still as the grave. It wasn't until the sound of approaching sirens pierced the silence that I dared to breathe a sigh of relief. Help had finally arrived, and with it, the promise of safety from the unseen menace that had haunted my every waking moment. The police arrived in a flurry of activity, their voices a comforting presence in the darkness. They swept through the apartment with trained precision, searching for any sign of an intruder. But to my dismay, they found nothing out of the ordinary, no signs of forced entry, no trace of the mysterious presence that had terrorized me for so long. As the officers left, assuring me that they would increase patrols in the area, I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare was far from over. The shadow in the night still lurked just beyond the edges of my perception, its malevolent presence a constant reminder of the fragility of my newfound independence. In the days that followed, I took precautions to protect myself, installing security cameras, double locking my doors, and never venturing out alone after dark. But no amount of security measures could ease the gnawing fear that had taken root in my heart. Months passed, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Yet, the feeling of being watched never truly faded. It followed me like a shadow, lurking just beyond the edges of my consciousness, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked in the world around me. Then, one fateful night, as I lay in bed, the feeling of being watched intensified to the point of suffocation. I glanced around the room, but the darkness revealed nothing out of the ordinary. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness that hung heavy in the air. With a sense of dread, I reached for my phone and checked the security camera footage. What I saw sent chills down my spine, a shadowy figure, a obscured by darkness, standing just beyond the reach of the camera's lens. Its eyes, glowing with an otherworldly light, seemed to bore into my very soul, filling me with a sense of dread, unlike anything I had ever known. In that moment, I knew that the shadow in the night had never truly left. It had lingered, biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, as it stood just beyond the threshold of my perception, I realized with a sinking heart that I was powerless to stop it. The question remains what other unseen terrors lurk in the darkness, waiting to prey upon the unsuspecting. I never imagined a simple trip to the city could spiral into a nightmare. It all started innocently enough. I was heading back from work, walking down the bustling streets of downtown. The neon lights shimmered against the darkness, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance with every flicker. As I weaved through the crowd, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. It was subtle at first, like a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I brushed it off, attributing it to the paranoia of walking alone at night. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. I quickened my pace, hoping to shake off whatever imaginary presence was trailing me. Yet every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing but the usual sea of faces lost in their own worlds. Just as I turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A fleeting shadow darted across the alley, disappearing before I could focus on it. My heart pounded in my chest as I hesitated, debating whether to investigate or continue on my way home. Against my better judgment, curiosity got the better of me. I cautiously stepped into the narrow alley, the darkness swallowing me whole. The faint sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls, creating an eerie symphony that sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the darkness, grabbing hold of my arm with a vice-like grip. I let out a startled cry, struggling against my assailant's hold. But before I could react, the grip loosened, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. My heart raced as I stumbled out of the alley, my mind reeling from the encounter. Who was that person? And why were they lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce on unsuspecting victims like me? Days passed, but the encounter in the alley continued to haunt me. Every shadow seemed to morph into a lurking figure, every rustle of the wind a whisper of impending danger. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down I knew better. One evening, as I returned home from work, I noticed something strange. The lock on my front door was tampered with, the metal twisted and mangled as if someone had tried to force their way in. Panic seized me as I fumbled for my phone, ready to dial the police. But before I could make the call, a voice echoed from behind me, freezing me in place. Looking for someone. I spun around to find a figure standing in the shadows, their features obscured by the darkness. My heart hammered in my chest as I took a step back, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady despite the terror coursing through my veins. The figure stepped forward, revealing their face in the dim light. It was a man, his features twisted into a sinister grin that sent chills down my spine. "I'm just a friend," he replied, his voice dripping with malice. "A friend who's been watching you." My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. This man, this stranger lurking in the shadows, had been following me all along. But why? And what did he want from me? I fled from my apartment, the sound of my pounding footsteps echoing in the empty streets. Behind me, I could hear the man's laughter, a chilling sound that spurred me on even faster. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to escape. With every passing moment, the darkness seemed to close in around me, threatening to swallow me whole. I ducked into alleyways and side streets, desperate to lose my pursuer in the labyrinth of the city. But no matter how fast I ran or how many twists and turns I took, he was always one step behind me, his presence like a shadow that refused to be shaken off. Finally, exhausted and out of breath, I found myself trapped in a dead-end alley with nowhere left to run. I turned to face my stalker, my heart sinking as I realized the futility of my efforts. The man stepped forward, his grin widening as he closed in on me. "You can't escape me," he taunted, his voice echoing off the walls. But just as he reached out to grab me, a blinding light pierced the darkness, illuminating the alley with an otherworldly glow. I shielded my eyes against the glare, unable to comprehend what was happening. When I finally lowered my hand, the man was gone, vanished into thin air, as if he had never been there at all. I stumbled out of the alley, shaken but alive, grateful to be free from the clutches of my relentless pursuer. As I made my way back home, the events of the night replayed in my mind like a twisted nightmare. Who was that man? And what did he want with me? The answers came sooner than I expected. When I arrived at my apartment, I found a letter waiting for me, tucked under the door. With trembling hands, I tore it open, my heart sinking as I read the words scrawled across the page. "I'll be seeing you soon," it read, followed by a chilling message that sent shivers down my spine. "You can run, but you can't hide. I'll always be watching." My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. The man who had been stalking me was no ordinary predator. He was something far more sinister, a shadowy presence that defied explanation. But despite the fear gnawing at my insides, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't let him win. I would fight, tooth and nail, until I was free from his grasp once and for all. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, but the shadowy figure never returned. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that I was safe at last. But deep down, I knew better. One night, as I lay in bed, the feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance. I tossed and turned, unable to shake off the sense of impending doom that hung over me like a dark cloud. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere outside my window. My blood ran cold as I sat up, straining my ears to listen. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone, ready to call for help. But before I could dial the number, a voice echoed from the darkness, freezing me in place. "Did you miss me?" I turned to find the shadowy figure standing in the corner of my room, his eyes gleaming with malice. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled to get away, but it was too late. He lunged forward, his hands closing around my throat with a vice-like grip. I fought back with all my strength, but it was no use. In the end, darkness consumed me, swallowing me whole as the world faded away into nothingness. They say that evil never truly dies, that it lingers in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. And though I may be gone, my story lives on, a cautionary tale of the horrors that lurk in the darkness. I was your average tech-savvy guy, always plugged into the digital world, scrolling through social media feeds and connecting with friends online. But one day I noticed something strange, a shadow on my screen, lurking just beyond the edges of my perception. In the beginning, I brushed it off as a glitch, a trick of the light cast by my computer monitor. But as days turned into weeks, the shadow persisted, growing more pronounced with each passing day. It seemed to follow me wherever I went, a silent observer in the digital realm. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But as the days stretched into months, the feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. It was as if someone or something was monitoring my every move, lurking just beyond the confines of my digital world. I tried to rationalize the strange occurrences, attributing them to the stresses of everyday life. But deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong. The shadow on my screen seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its presence a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edges of my perception. As the weeks passed, the shadow began to encroach upon my digital space, manifesting in strange and unsettling ways. I would receive cryptic messages from unknown accounts, filled with ominous warnings and veiled threats. Images would appear on my screen, distorted and twisted beyond recognition, sending shivers down my spine. I tried to block the accounts to delete the images, but they always found a way back, creeping into my digital world like a virus infecting a system. No matter how hard I tried to escape, the shadow on my screen seemed determined to drag me down into the depths of its darkness. Desperate for answers, I turned to the internet in search of guidance. But the more I searched, the deeper I fell into the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and urban legends. It seemed that I was not alone in my plight, that others had encountered the shadow on the screen and fallen victim to its sinister influence. Then, one fateful night, as I sat alone in my darkened apartment, the shadow on my screen took on a life of its own. It began to pulse and swirl, twisting and contorting in ways that defied logical explanation. Panic surged through me as I watched in horror, powerless to stop the digital nightmare that was unfolding before my eyes. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the shadow on my screen vanished, leaving behind a void of empty pixels. I sat in stunned silence, my heart pounding in my chest with a primal intensity. What had just happened? Had I imagined the entire ordeal, or was there something more sinister at play? As I sat alone in the darkness, the realization dawned on me: the shadow on my screen was not just a glitch or a figment of my imagination. It was a malevolent force, lurking in the digital realm, waiting to ensnare unsuspecting victims in its web of darkness. Terrified and alone, I retreated further into the depths of my apartment, seeking solace in the safety of my own solitude. But even as I locked the doors and drew the curtains tight, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow on my screen was still out there, lurking just beyond the edges of my perception. Days turned into weeks, and the shadow on my screen became a constant presence in my life, haunting my every waking moment with its sinister presence. I tried to block it out, to go about my daily routine as if nothing had changed, but the feeling of being watched never truly faded. Then, one day, as I sat alone in my apartment, the power went out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic seized me as I fumbled for my phone, desperate for any source of light in the oppressive blackness. But as the screen flickered to life, I saw it, the shadow, lurking just beyond the edges of the screen, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. With a cry of terror, I smashed the phone against the ground, shattering the screen into a million pieces. But even as the device lay in ruins at my feet, the shadow persisted, its presence a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edges of my perception.